At the Midwest auction in Indianapolis, Matthew Rowland raised his hand and won 18 vehicles that nobody wanted. He paid $3,000 for the entire lot. Laughter rippled through the warehouse. The sharpest came from Valerie Sutton, director of Union Motors, standing near the press with a smile that cut through the air. She said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "He just bought $3,000 worth of scrap metal. I hope he hasn't lost the junkyard's number." A phone recorded every second. Matthew signed the papers, tucked the copy into his denim jacket, and walked to his truck without a single word. He knew something that no one else in that room knew. 35 days later, Valerie Sutton would drive to his shop to look for him. What were those 18 cars hiding? Stick with this story. The ending is something nobody saw coming. The Midwest auction was held 3 times a year in a converted warehouse south of Indianapolis. Most of the attendees were small-time resellers, a few lucky collectors, and the occasional mechanic who could spot a good chassis just by bending down. Matthew Rowland had been attending for 4 years. He always arrived alone, always early, always wearing the same faded green plaid shirt that made him look more like a random neighbor than a bidder. His truck was a 2003 model with a broken right mirror and a tailgate that didn't close all the way. He had no assistant, no business cards, no company name painted on the door. To anyone looking at him, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a single father with a modest budget and no special plan. But Matthew had been tracking Lot 24 for 7 weeks not by chance, but with an obsessive method. He had requested the full vehicle identification list 3 days after the lot was posted, cross-referenced every number with the production records kept in 3 filing cabinets his late father had left in a Fort Wayne storage unit, and had gone to the impound lot on a Tuesday when the place was empty to walk among the cars with a flashlight and a notepad. Most people looking at those 18 vehicles saw rust, shattered glass, gutted interiors, missing engines, and decades of accumulated neglect. Matthew saw an entirely different set of facts. 4 of the 18 cars had specific identifiers that the auction listing hadn't even mentioned, because the people preparing those lists weren't looking for what he was looking for. Car number 9 was a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. The exterior was a disaster. Layers of blistered paint, a collapsed front panel, no seats, no rear glass. But Matthew had used a wire brush on the firewall during his Tuesday visit and found the identification number stamped into the original metal, clean and unaltered. The number matched a production sequence corresponding to fewer than 300 units ever made. In the collector's market, a verified Z28 in any restorable condition was worth between $45,000 and $60,000 properly restored. Car number 15 was a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda with its original engine in a separate crate, but a body that had somehow survived decades in a dry Ohio shed before ending up at a garage sale in Helena. The chrome was intact, the floorboards solid, and the original color code could still be read on the door frame. A compatible replacement engine was available through a network of contacts Matthew had cultivated for years. Restored, it would fetch around $35,000 to $40. Ling ling ling. Those 2 cars alone justified the price of the entire lot several times over. But it was car number 3 that kept Matthew awake at night. It was at the end of the row, half buried under a frayed tarp, so corroded and deformed that 3 different buyers had walked right past it without stopping. He noticed it only because of the roofline, a particular geometry that matched a set of photographs in one of his father's filing cabinets. Gabriel Roland had been a restoration engineer for over 35 years before passing away. A man who had worked on more than 200 significant American vehicles and had taken notes on all of them. A 1993 entry described the tracking of a prototype vehicle from the defunct Vega Automotive Company. A 1972 V8 development chassis, which was the only surviving physical record of a series of patented engines Vega had been developing before the company folded in 1975. Gabriel's notes described the car as likely destroyed, but also listed a frame identifier that would make it unmistakable if it ever surfaced. Matthew had crouched under car number 3 with his flashlight for almost 6 minutes before finding the engraving on the dried, mud-covered chassis rail. VGA 872P1. He photographed it and stood up, dusted off his knees, and walked back to his truck. He didn't say a word to anyone, didn't call anyone. He drove home and made dinner for his daughter Lucy, put her to bed, and spent 3 hours at the kitchen table reviewing his notes before falling asleep. He had $900 his checking account. He would offer $3,000 and save the rest for fuel and tools. The morning of the auction, his phone rang while he was loading chain gear into the bed of his truck. It was Tommy Barnes, his closest friend and occasional shop help. Tommy had helped Matthew move cars for years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. But even he had doubts. "Are you really going to do this?" Tommy asked. Matthew said yes. "Those cars are garbage." "Man, I saw them." Matthew said he knew. "And you're going to put in almost everything you have." Matthew said that was correct. There was a pause on the line. "All right," Tommy finally said. "Call me when you need help towing." Matthew closed the tailgate as best he could and drove toward the warehouse. On his left wrist, as always, he wore his father's watch, a mechanical piece that had stopped working in the winter of 2013 and that Matthew had never sent to be repaired. He wore it anyway. You keep some things, not because they work, but because of what they represent. Valerie Sutton arrived at the warehouse an hour after registration opened, accompanied by Derek Vance, her chief legal counsel, and a small group of journalists from 2 automotive industry publications. She wore a navy blue dress over a white blouse and moved through the room with the particular way people move when they are used to being the most important person in the room, not aggressively, but with a quiet certainty that the space would accommodate her. At 32, Valerie was the youngest CEO in the history of Union Motors, a company that had been in the market for 25 years. The company operated in the upper-middle segment of the vehicle trade, used luxury inventory, curated auctions, fleet consulting for corporate clients. Under her leadership over the previous 2 years, revenues had grown significantly. A profile in a business magazine 3 months earlier had described her as a precision instrument in a brute force industry. She kept the framed article on the wall behind her desk, not out of vanity, but as a reminder of the standard she had set for herself. Her purpose at the auction was specific and limited. Union Motors was preparing an exhibition of restored American classics for an upcoming industry event in the fall, and her acquisitions team had identified 2 vehicles in the current inventory as candidates for purchase. Neither was in Lot 24. She had zero interest in Lot 24. She was aware of it, just as anyone in the room was. That pile of unsellable cars that would probably go for scrap value if anyone bought them at all. When she first noticed Matthew, he was crouching next to one of the cars with his back to the room. running his hand along the base of a door panel. She registered him as an experienced professional registers irrelevant information. Briefly. Categorically. Without retention. Plaid shirt. Old truck. Lone bidder at a surplus auction. He wasn't a factor. She kept walking toward the registration table and didn't think of him again until the bidding for Lot 24 began. The lot came up mid-session. The auctioneer's assistant read the description, 18 vehicles. Mixed years. Mixed condition. No confirmed running engines. Sold as is with no title guarantee on 5 of the units. The starting bid was set at $600. The room was silent. A few people looked on without raising their paddles. Matthew raised his without hesitation and said clearly, "San Meiyuan." Ling, ling, ling. The auctioneer confirmed. A moment passed. No competitive bid came in. Another moment. Going once. The auctioneer said. The room remained still. Going twice. A few heads turned toward Matthew. Some people smiled. Sut. The gavel came down. The laughter started at the edges and spread inward. It wasn't exactly cruel. More like the reflex amusement of people watching someone do something they collectively considered foolish. Valerie was standing near the press area when it happened. And something about the moment the camera pointed at her. The journalists nearby. The easy target of a man in a denim jacket with an old truck. Epilogue Fortrait. 000 drew a response from her that she would later struggle to fully explain to herself. She said it with the casual authority of someone used to being quoted. He just bought $3. 000 worth of scrap metal. I hope he hasn't lost the junkyard's number. The people around her laughed. One of the journalists smiled. The phone camera was already recording. Matthew heard it. He was 4 rows away, signing the purchase confirmation with the auction clerk. He heard the words, and he heard the laughter. And he turned his head to look directly at Valerie Sutton for about 4 seconds. His expression didn't change. He didn't blush. He didn't tense his shoulders. He didn't open his mouth. He just gave a small nod in her general direction. It wasn't agreement or submission. Just the barest acknowledgement that he had heard. And then he turned back to the clerk and finished signing. The clerk handed him his copies. Matthew folded them into his shirt pocket, picked up the chain gear he had left near the door, and walked out to his truck. The camera footage ended there. With the crowd still laughing and Matthew's back disappearing through the door. The clip was 38 seconds long. By midnight, it had racked up tens of thousands of views. Most were under some version of the same title. Single dad spends life savings on 18 junk cars and gets mocked by CEO. Valerie's name was in the title of most of them. She saw them before going to sleep that night. Several people on her team had sent her the links with laughing reactions. She didn't reply to any of them and left her phone face down on her nightstand. It seemed like the end of the story. It was not the end of the story. Matthew spent the next 3 days with Tommy moving the 18 vehicles to a rented shop in an industrial park 6 miles east of downtown Indianapolis. The building was spacious, with a cheap metal roof and enough room to park the 18 cars in 2 rows with walking space between them. Tommy helped manage the tow chain and the flatbed, saying very little until the last car was inside and the overhead lights were turned on. Then he stood in the middle of the shop with his arms crossed, looked at the rows of wrecked vehicles, hanging doors, smashed windshields, frames pitted with corrosion, and said, "This is a pile of garbage." Matthew was already crouching next to car number 3. Not replying. Not that I'm being negative. Tommy said. Just describing what I see. Matthew stood up and looked down the row. You're describing what's visible, he said. That's different from what's actually there. He handed Tommy a clipboard with a numbered inspection chart and told him to start at the opposite end. They worked systematically over the next 5 days. Matthew applied the same method his father had taught him: no assumptions, no shortcuts, a full inventory before any decisions on priorities. He started with the vehicles he expected the least from, working his way inward to the ones he knew mattered. Every car received a full inspection, checking the floorboards, verifying the VIN plate and any visible identification marks, and logging an entry on the clipboard chart. Matthew worked in silence. Tommy worked beside him and asked questions when he had them. And Matthew answered without condescension. How does someone answer when they truly believe the other person can understand the full answer? Most of the 18 cars confirmed what the auction list had suggested. Some were worth it for parts. Others had usable chassis components. A few had specific hardware that small restoration shops would pay for. He noted each one and set his estimates. Then he got to car number 9. He cleaned the grime off the firewall with a solvent rag and a wire brush. He uncovered the stamped number, photographed it, and called a collector in Chicago named Harrison, who had been looking for a verified Z28 for 4 years. Harrison called back in under 15 minutes. His voice was controlled, but not entirely steady. He asked twice if Matthew was sure about the engraving. Matthew read the number out loud both times. Harrison said he could come down on the weekend and asked what Matthew needed to hand it over. They discussed terms after the call. Matthew sat on an overturned bucket for a moment and did some rough math in a notebook. For the Camaro alone, he jotted down $47. Ling ling ling. Car number 15 took more time. The engine bay was empty and had been for a while. But when Matthew opened the door and inspected the data plate on the door frame, the original color code and production sequence were legible. He took measurements of the floors, tapped the inner frame rails, checked the firewall mounting points. The structure was solid. He had a contact in Nashville, Rye, who specialized in period-correct replacement engines for exactly that model year. A man who kept a private inventory and didn't advertise publicly. Matthew sent him a message with the specs. The reply came that night. The engine was available. Delivery in 12 days. The cost was manageable relative to the projected resale margin. He added car number 15 to his priority column. And then there was car number 3. Matthew waited for Tommy to go home before fully uncovering it. He worked the hardened mud off the chassis rail with a stiff brush and a slow application of solvent. Unhurried. Unforced. The engraving emerged letter by letter from the mud. VGA 872 P1. He pressed his thumb against the cold metal to confirm the depth of the impression. It was original. He took a fresh set of photographs with his phone, then opened his laptop and pulled up a scanned file of his father's engineering, notes, pages typed and handwritten and annotated over 3 decades of work. The entry on the Vega V8 prototype was 15 pages long. Gabriel Roland had first found references to the vehicle in 1989 while working on a related documentation project for a private collector. He had traced the production records through 2 acquisitions and a company dissolution, ultimately concluding that the physical vehicle had likely been lost in a facility disposal in Ohio in the late 1980s. But he had also written, in his careful, deliberate handwriting at the bottom of the last page, if the chassis survived, it will bear the code VGA 872P1. That engraving is the only unforgeable proof of its identity. Matthew read that line twice, closed the laptop, stood in the shop for a while without moving, set his alarm for 5:30 am, drove home, and went to sleep. By the end of the first week, the rough calculations in Matthew's notebook had grown into a full projection spreadsheet, even being conservative. Assuming issues with the replacement engine delivery, assuming lower than expected prices on the secondary vehicles, assuming no unusual demand, the numbers far exceeded $250. Ling ling ling. If the Camaro went as expected, if the Barracuda met its restoration estimate, and if the Vega represented even a fraction of what Matthew suspected it might be worth to the right buyer, the complete picture was something he hadn't let himself think about until he had it written down in front of him. He sat with the numbers for a long time. Then, he folded the paper in half, put it in the filing cabinet with his father's notes, and went back to work. What Matthew didn't know, and had no way of knowing, was that inside the Union Motors offices on the other side of Indianapolis, a file had been open for 11 months bearing the name of one particular car. Union Motors was in the middle of a $250 million federal lawsuit against Foster Motor Group, a mid-sized powertrain manufacturer based in Michigan. The core of the case was a claim of derivative design theft. The Union Motors legal team argued that the fundamental architecture of Foster's current family of commercial V8 engines had been lifted without authorization from a patented prototype design that Union Motors had acquired through a chain of corporate mergers dating back to the early 1980s, a chain that included, at its origin point, the intellectual property portfolio of the Vega Automotive Company. Dissolved in 1975. The prototype in question was the 1972 Vega V8 development chassis. Derek Vance had built a substantial, but not definitive, documentary case. Foster's legal team had introduced enough ambiguity into the paper trail to keep the judge uncertain, and the central hearing was now 53 days away. What Union Motors needed to resolve that ambiguity was physical evidence, a material artifact bearing the original Vega development marks. Something that couldn't be dismissed as a document reproduction or an assumption of chain of custody. What they needed, specifically, was the chassis. And for 11 months, Derek Vance had believed the chassis didn't exist. He had tracked the vehicle through 7 states and 3 private collection sales, eventually arriving at a disposal manifest from an Ohio facility dated 1990. The manifest listed a 1972 prototype frame under a partial identifier that matched the Vega records closely enough to satisfy his research team. He had presented this to Valerie as a closed find. The path for physical evidence was exhausted. They would proceed on documentary grounds and accept the elevated risk. Valerie had read the memo, asked 3 precise questions, received 3 precise answers, and moved on. The file remained open only in a technical sense, because the case itself was ongoing. The night after the auction, Derek got home, set down his briefcase, poured a glass of water, and turned on the TV. The clip popped up on his feed as he grabbed the remote. He watched it once, watched it again, and didn't laugh. He stared at the frozen thumbnail image at the end of the clip. The parking lot, the flatbed, the 2 rows of wrecked vehicles being lined up near Matthew's truck. In the background of the thumbnail, car number 3 was partially visible, its specific roofline geometry, the particular proportion of the windshield rake, the shape of the engine hood. Derek had spent 11 months looking at photographs of the Vega prototype. His threshold for recognition was lower than most people's. He closed the clip, opened a different app, and pulled up the original photographs of the vehicle from Gabriel Roland's archived records, which his research team had been using as reference material. He looked at the roofline in the archive photo. He looked at the roofline in the thumbnail. He closed the app, went to his kitchen, and stood there for about 2 minutes doing absolutely nothing. Then he went to his home office, opened the auction house website, and navigated to the Lot 24 listing. Car number 3 was described as 1970 2V8 prototype. Unidentified manufacturer. The frame and body only. He read it twice. He found the chassis dimensional specs that the listing agent had entered as standard fields. They matched. He didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, Derek arrived at the Union Motors offices before Valerie and pulled the complete auction records to confirm the buyer's information. He called the technical director at 7:20 a.m. The Vega V8 chassis as a frame identifié. What prefix does it use? The answer came in less than 3 minutes. VGA 870. 2. Derek thanked him and ended the call. He printed a single page from the auction records, walked down the hall to Valerie's office, and placed it on her desk when she arrived. "We have a problem," he said. She read the page. The room remained silent for a long time. Then she said, flat out, "Get me his contact information." The first approach was clumsy, and Matthew recognized it immediately. On the 4th day after the auction, 2 men arrived at the shop wearing clothes that were slightly too new and asking questions about part sourcing with the specific expertise of people who had been briefed on what to ask, but didn't actually know the subject. One of them kept looking toward the covered shape at the back of the shop. Matthew answered their questions with complete politeness and zero information. He confirmed he wasn't selling anything from the lot at the moment. He thanked them for visiting. He watched them back out of the driveway and said to Tommy, who was polishing the Camaro's side panel, "They'll send someone with more authority in about 3 days." Tommy looked up. Union Motors. Matthew nodded. So they found out about the Vega. Matthew said it was a reasonable assumption. Tommy said, "You're not worried?" Matthew thought about this for a moment. Worried? About what? Exactly, he said, and went back to work. While the legal posturing happened across town, Matthew's actual work was producing results. He had prioritized 9 vehicles from the secondary group for rapid processing. 2 of them required only mechanical cleaning and minor bodywork and were sold within the first 14 days to a local dealer who ran a small lot on the west side. 3 others went through the network of forums where Tommy had posted, a community of dedicated collectors who valued verified provenance over cosmetic presentation. The forum post was simple. A few photographs. The completed work. The asking price. No stories. No sales language. The replies came quickly. The quality of the work wasn't what the forum members expected from the story they had been following, and they had been following it. The clip had circulated in the collector community, along with commentary from people who actually understood what it meant to pull a viable chassis out of a scrap lot. The reaction there was different from the mainstream reaction. Several seasoned collectors had seen the clip and said privately, and later publicly, that the man in the denim jacket knew exactly what he was doing. Tommy's forum posts were the confirmation. The photographs showed meticulous, unhurried work, the kind of restoration that prioritized precision over speed, that replaced what needed replacing and preserved what didn't, that treated the vehicle's original engineering as something worthy of respect rather than something to hide under fresh paint. Several collectors replied to the thread to say they had assumed the clip was the whole story and were now revising that assumption. A few asked if there was additional inventory available. Tommy replied that updates would be posted as the work was completed. The thread kept growing. By day 16, total cash received from the lot was $21. Ling ling ling. By day 22, it was crossing $32. 000 when the sale of the Camaro was finalized with Harrison from Chicago. The collector drove down, spent 50 minutes with the car, made 4 phone calls to verify the identification number through his own network, and then wrote a check. The amount on the check was $51. Ling ling ling. Matthew deposited it at the Madison Avenue branch, drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the balance on his phone screen for a while. Then he made a grocery list. Union Motors' second approach came on day 25. No middleman this time, Valerie alone. Arriving at the shop shortly after 1:00 p.m. In a gray sedan she had driven herself. She parked outside, stood in the open bay door for a moment, observing the interior, and then walked in. Matthew was under the Barracuda on a creeper. He heard the footsteps and the shift in ambient sound, and slid out from under the car without rushing. He saw her, registered her presence, stood up, and wiped his hands on a shop rag. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. "I was wondering when you'd come yourself." He said it as a statement, not a challenge. Valerie had prepared a negotiation. She had a number in mind, a position from which to open a mapped set of responses to the various directions the conversation might take. She was very good at negotiations. What she hadn't prepared for was standing in a working shop and looking at 11 restored or in-progress vehicles arranged in neat rows, each representing a level of craftsmanship that had nothing to do with her assumptions about the man who had bought them. She took a moment longer than she intended before speaking. "We're interested in buying car number 3, she said. 40美元. Ling ling ling. Wired today. Matthew looked at her without expression. "No," he said. She adjusted. 60美元. Ling ling ling. He said no again, with the same flat simplicity, as if they were discussing the weather. She recalibrated. He wasn't a man holding out for a higher number. She tried a different approach. "What do you know about it?" she asked. He walked across the shop to where the Vega sat under its tarp. I folded back an edge and focused a work light on the chassis rail. The engraved identifier was fully visible under the glare. Clean, deep, unmistakable. Vaga 872 pet. He held the light steady and watched her face as she read it. "I know it's the only one," he said. She remained silent for several seconds. "Why don't you want to sell?" she asked. Her voice had changed. The executive register was still there, but something underneath had shifted in texture. Matthew covered the car again and turned to face her. "Because I know what it's worth to Union Motors specifically," he said. "And you know that I know." She left without reaching an agreement. It was the first time in several years she had walked away from a meeting without controlling its outcome. And the feeling stayed with her for the entire drive back. The next 5 days involved mounting pressure from both sides. Derek sent a formal written offer to Matthew via courier. $90. Ling ling ling. Structured with specific conditions regarding the timeline and transfer documentation. 2 days later, a different letter arrived. This time on legal letterhead, citing language about how Matthew's property might be subject to evidentiary considerations in pending litigation. Matthew took both letters to a local attorney named Fiona, who spent 25 minutes reviewing them and then told Matthew that the evidentiary language in the second letter was, in her professional opinion, a bluff. The vehicle had been purchased legitimately at a public auction, and no court order existed, nor had one been requested. Matthew owned the car. He was not obligated to sell. Cooperate. Or respond. Matthew thanked her, paid her consultation fee, and drove back to the shop. What he did next surprised Tommy, who had been quietly watching the pressure build for days. Matthew called Derek Vance's direct line, which he had found on the Union Motors corporate website. Derek answered on the second ring. Matthew identified himself and then said, without preamble, I want you to tell your CEO something. The other side, Foster, made contact through an intermediary 4 days ago. They offered me $220. 000 to make sure the car was unavailable before the hearing. I turned it down. I'm telling you this so you know the landscape you're operating in. I'm not going to sell to Foster and I'm not going to help them. But I'm not going to let you pressure me into selling to you either. Derek remained silent long enough for Matthew to wonder if the line had dropped. Then Derek said slowly, Why are you telling me this instead of keeping it as leverage? Matthew said. Because I have no interest in winning by letting someone else lose worse than necessary. Another silence. I will pass this on to Ms. Sutton. Derek said. Matthew said. Thank you. And ended the call. The sale of the Camaro on day 30 generated coverage Matthew hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have sought. He had taken the car to a small collector's event at a venue in the Fountain Square district. The kind of event where 50 or 60 people who know what they're looking at can properly evaluate the work. 3 journalists who had been following the Lot 24 story from the beginning were present, either by chance or by tracking the forum activity. When the Camaro sold for $54,000 to a Detroit collector who had been on the phone with Harrison the night before, the room reacted the way a room full of people who understand significance reacts, with a quiet, a specific appreciation of people seeing something done right. The journalists published their accounts within hours. The numbers in the coverage were accurate. A verified Z28. Fully restored. Solgt for 54,000. Out of a lot, bought entirely for $3. 000 by a man who had been publicly mocked for buying it. The story didn't need embellishment. The math spoke for itself. By day 30, 16 of the 18 vehicles were sold or committed. Matthew's total receipts from the lot, calculated in the workbench notebook that had replaced the kitchen table projections, reached $110. Ling ling ling. 2 cars remained. The Barracuda was 4 days away from completion. The Vega sat at the back of the shop, covered, untouched since Matthew had shown it to Valerie. Valerie read the coverage from her office with the hearing 22 days away, and Derek's projection sitting on her desk, showing a 38% probability of success in the best-case scenario without physical evidence. Then she asked her assistant to clear a spot in her afternoon schedule. She returned to the shop on day 31 at dusk, just as the last light was fading outside the bay doors. She wasn't wearing the navy blue dress. She had left Derek at the office. She stood in the doorway with both hands in her jacket pockets and said, as Matthew looked up from the Barracuda, I need to talk to you. Honestly. Not as a negotiation. He set down his wrench, looked at her for a moment, and then pointed to the 2 folding chairs near the workbench. Okay, he said. She told him everything. Not the executive summary she had been giving investors and board members, But the actual shape of things, the 1-month search, the documentary case that was almost strong enough, but not quite. The hearing in 22 days, what a loss would mean for Union Motors' core intellectual property portfolio and for the people who had built their careers around it. She told him that the car represented something his father had also understood as significant, which wasn't a manipulative observation, but simply an honest one. And then she said, "What do I need to offer you?" Matthew leaned back in his chair. He remained silent long enough for the ambient noise of the industrial park, a forklift in the distance, a loading dock, traffic on the overpass to become audible in the pause. Then he said, "Do you want to know why I bought that lot?" She said yes. He didn't tell her the whole story, but he told her the parts that mattered. The filing cabinets, the notes, his father's handwriting at the bottom of 15 pages of research, the watch on his wrist that still bore his father's thumbprint, worn into the crown from 35 years of winding it. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he was answering a question with true information. 160美元. 000 for the car, he said. She started to reply. And he continued. And one condition that has nothing to do with money. Union Motors funds a vocational training program in classic car restoration at the Indianapolis Tech Workshops. 70美元. 000 a year for 3 years. No press release required. No naming rights. No association with me. Just the program running. Teaching people who want to learn the trade. Valerie looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than most of their previous exchanges. She had negotiated with people worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And she had never heard a condition structured exactly like this, not geared toward personal recognition, not toward reciprocal commercial advantage, but simply toward making a thing continue to exist. "Why didn't you ask for a public apology?" she said. "They owe you one." Matthew thought about this. "I don't need that," he said. "You don't owe me the words. I think you already know you were wrong. You knew it before tonight." Something in Valerie's face changed. Not dramatically. Not with any particularly visible emotion. Just a shift in the quality of how she held her expression. "Yes," she said. "I knew." She extended her hand across the space between the two folding chairs. Matthew shook it without hesitation. Tommy, who had been working quietly at the far end of the shop and had heard most of it, served as a witness. Derek, whom Valerie called and who showed up in under an hour, served as the other. The agreement was handwritten. Both parties signed 2 copies. And Derek took one. It was 11:20 at night. Matthew made coffee. Tommy made a comment about the absurdity of the situation. And everyone in the shop laughed. Briefly and genuinely. The way people laugh when something very strange has been resolved into something very simple. The V8 chassis was documented, transported, and introduced as material evidence at the federal hearing 17 days later. The frame identifier, production marks, and chain of provenance that Derek's team had reconstructed from the auction records and Gabriel Rowland's archived materials proved sufficient to resolve the documentary ambiguity that Foster's legal team had been exploiting. The judge ruled in favor of Union Motors. Foster Motor Group was ordered to cease commercial production of the disputed engine variant and to initiate remediation proceedings on the revenue already generated. The case would continue in its damages phase for some time. But the judicial determination, the one Union Motors had been trying to establish for 2.5 years, was settled. Valerie heard the ruling in the courtroom, said very little afterward, and declined the celebratory dinner her team had organized for that night. She drove home alone. when a reporter asked her about the story of the car 3 weeks after the ruling. In the context of a longer profile on the litigation outcome, she gave an answer her publicist hadn't reviewed and her communications team hadn't been consulted on. "I made a flawed assessment," she said. "Not about the value of the cars, but about the value of the person standing next to them. They aren't the same kind of mistake. But I made both at the same time." She didn't elaborate, and the journalist didn't press. The quote appeared in the article without her name in the pull quote, which was exactly how she preferred it. The vocational program at Indianapolis Tech launched 8 weeks after the agreement was signed, with 15 students enrolled in its first cohort. The curriculum was built around documentation, teardown, structural evaluation, and period-correct restoration. Not the cosmetic shortcut version, but the full technical practice. Matthew visited twice during the first semester at the coordinator's invitation, not as a guest speaker, and not to assume any formal role, but simply to walk around the shop and answer questions from students who wanted to know specific things. He answered them the same way his father had answered him, directly, without oversimplification, assuming the person asking could handle the full truth of the answer. The Barracuda was the last vehicle from Lot 24 that Matthew worked on. He finished it 6 days after the hearing concluded, rolled it out of the shop into the morning light, and stood next to it for a long time. The color was a deep metallic blue with chrome that caught the October sunlight in a very particular way. Long and clean along the hood line. He had repainted it to the original factory spec, not because it was more valuable that way, but because he had found a 1976 photograph in one of his father's filing cabinets. Gabriel Rowland standing next to a car of exactly this color in that year, in a driveway Matthew didn't recognize. Squinting against the sun with the specific expression of a man who is very satisfied with a job just finished. Matthew had looked at that photograph countless times in his life. He never thought he would have a reason to look at it, then look up and see the exact same car in front of him. He didn't try to explain how that felt, not even to Tommy, who had been with him through the entire process. Some things don't need narration. By the end of day 35 after the auction, Matthew's total receipts from Lot 24, including the sale of the chassis to Union Motors, were $324. 000 from a $3,000 purchase. He used a portion of it to sign a long-term lease on the shop, buy the equipment he had been renting, and register a business name with the state, Rowland Restorations. He had business cards printed for the first time in his adult life. He placed them in a small stack on the corner of the workbench, next to the coffee maker, next to his father's filing cabinets, and left them there for whoever might need them. He didn't sell the Barracuda. He moved it to the back corner of the shop where it was visible from the main work area. That specific blue, that specific chrome, the hood line exactly right under the fluorescent lights, the corner of the windshield where the defroster vent met the glass. He left his father's watch face up on the dashboard, the cracked crystal, the stopped hands, the worn crown, not repaired, not hidden, simply present, because the important things always are. If you know how to look. Did you enjoy these stories of resilience and second chances? Please subscribe. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss any content.